In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about the debugging methods and debugging tools you might use to help identify errors in your code and address them. And so I have here an Excel file that we built in our form controls and form code videos early on when we discussed how to build user form and use a user form in Excel. And so what we have in this particular form is I can add employees to this table, and I can select whatever role they're in, enter a first name. So we'll just do an example. We'll just say Hannah Smith, and we won't check full time, so we'll just click add, and we can see the employee has been added to the table, and on my actual table we can see that her name does appear here with the information that we selected. So we're going to go ahead and go to the Developer tab, and we're going to open up our Visual Basic window. And I'll go ahead and I'll make this full screen. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open up the code that appears in my actual form by right-clicking and selecting View Code. And we can see here, this is all the code that's tied to my form itself. And so we're going to talk a little bit about different methods we might use for debugging and identifying the errors in our code. So up here you can see VBA actually has a debug menu that you can click on. And we can see step into, step over, step out, run to cursor, add watch, quick watches, edit watches, breakpoints, etc. And so this is what we're going to talk through in this video, are these particular tools and how we can apply some of these tools to our code. So we've actually used some breakpoints before, and this is actually what appears when you click to the left of a line, and it highlights this line in red. And this means this line is a breakpoint for our code. So as our code runs through this particular subroutine, it's actually going to break on this line and give us access to our code so we can make some adjustments or see where we are at in the code. So I'm going to break a little bit later. I'm going to break on this roll line, and now I'm going to go back to my Excel file. I'm going to go ahead and add an employee, and I'll just fill some random values in here so that we can just get an idea of what's going to show up. And I'm going to click add. And we can see it has successfully broke the code on this specific line that we asked it to break on. And this is a good way to pause your code, maybe after you've assigned all your variables or something, so you can come back through and you can actually check what your variables are. So I can hover over my first variable, my last variable, my start variable, and I can see what values are currently stored into all of those. I can also see right now my role doesn't have an assigned variable, and that's because I haven't actually executed this line of code yet. So wherever you add a break, it'll pause on that line before running that line. Now if we want to step through this line by line, we can either use debug step into, or we can just press F8 on our keyboard. So I will hit F8. And we can see now we've moved past this roll line. If I hover over roll, I can see we've assigned it the value of sales. Run to cursor is another helpful tool. So if I move my cursor down, say this is the next line I want to stop on, rather than adding a break, if we don't want to have to add another break into our code, we can use debug, run to cursor, or control and F8. And we can see this time it ran directly to where I had my cursor, which was on this line. It has actually executed these in-between lines. I can see that when I hover over those variables, and I can see what those values are. So this debug menu up here has some really helpful things in step into and run to cursor. We've talked a little bit about our breakpoints and things like that. So the next thing we'll talk about is adding a watch. And what a watch does is in this window down here, and this will show up when you add a watch or edit a watch, you can assign a watch on a particular variable or something that you're interested in tracking throughout your code. And then as you run your code, you can see how that variable changes values or context or type or anything like that. And so it's super helpful for if you have a really long piece of code where you're using the same variable for multiple values, or maybe you're doing some math on a variable or something, and you want to see how that variable changes. So we can select a variable. We'll just do this for our first variable here as an example, and we will add a watch. And we can see it's automatically selected this first expression because that's what I had my mouse on when I actually clicked on this. And it shows us the context that we're running this in and the module that we're running this in. And so all this means is we're in this particular add button subroutine here, and we're in our add employee module, which is just the code that's tied to our add employee form. So I can click OK. And we can see this has showed up down at the bottom of our screen here. The variable is first. This is what we're tracking. We can see right now we've stored the value f into this variable, which we could also figure out by hovering over the variable. But if you wanted to do this with a bunch of watches instead of having to add a break and then manually come through and hover over each variable to see its value, you could do that with watches instead. So watches are another very helpful tool for debugging and seeing if your variables are reading correctly. You can also build message boxes in at strategic points in your code for testing purposes. So if I don't want to have to use any breaks and I don't want to have to use any watches or anything like that, I just want to run my code cleanly and I want to know when I get to certain points in my code, I could build a message box. So for example, I could build a message box here that says the variable r is and then show me the variable r. And when I run this line, a message box will pop up on my screen that shows me what my variable r is. So I know at this point, okay, I've successfully hit this line in my code. I know that my r variable is whatever is being displayed on my screen. So that'll give me an idea of, okay, I can successfully run to this point in my code, and I know my variable r either is or isn't pulling correctly. And so you can use message boxes to build in little checks in your code just for developer purposes. And then later on, you can come back through and you can comment out these lines with an apostrophe. And that way it makes it a little easier for you. If you ever run into an error in the future, you can come through and uh, turn those message box lines back on and get an idea of where your error is actually existing. Now, one of the most common types of errors that you'll get in your code are variable errors, and this generally references when you have a variable that you've declared incorrectly. And so what that means is if we declare this variable, the first name variable, for example, as an integer instead of as a string, then later on in our code, we're going to get a little bit of an issue when we try to assign a text value of f to a variable that we have predetermined should be an integer, and that'll throw an error. You can also get an error if you assign text to a variable that you later on try to perform math on. That would also give you an error because you can't perform math on just text. So the most common error is variable mismatch error, which is what we just discussed. So if you ever have some variables that don't seem to be pulling correctly or that are throwing errors, that's the first thing that I would go in and check, is make sure that your type that you've declared your variable as matches up to what that variable is actually representative of. Another common error is performing work on the wrong sheet or reading data from the wrong sheet or even the wrong workbook in Excel. And this goes back to when we were talking about the object hierarchy and how important the object hierarchy is. We can see here I've gone ahead and specified I'm going to activate my sheet 1 worksheet, and all of the code that follows will be applied to this active worksheet, which is sheet 1. It's important that we keep that in mind as we move through our code, and we make sure we're always looking at the right workbook and the right worksheet in the right range. And so this is something that also causes a lot of error, drives a lot of error later on, is if we're not paying attention to what is our active worksheet or our active workbook, and are we referencing the right worksheet and the right workbook and the right data. And so this is the second thing that I would check if you ever are getting an error or your code isn't running as you expect it to. Now, VBA is also very good about actually giving you an error code anytime it encounters an error. And so generally speaking, if we have an error that our code experiences while it's running, VBA is going to go ahead and pause. It's going to pull up this window. It's going to highlight the line just like this is highlighted. It's going to highlight the line that is giving an error, and it's going to give you a little pop-up window that has an error code in it. And that error code is something that you can actually Google, or you can get on Microsoft's help site, which is a great resource, and you can figure out exactly what that error code means. And that gives you a more specific idea of what you need to address, and you know the issue that is existing is on whatever line is highlighted, so you know what you need to address and where you need to address it. So VBA actually has its own built-in error addressing functionality that makes it a lot easier for you to address any errors that you are getting. But with that being said, you don't necessarily want your code to break and open up for any user who happens to be in the code. So you don't necessarily want a file that you're pushing out to a big group of people to have an error that lets your users get into the background code and mess up the background code. And so there are some error handlers that we can build into VBA that will take an error and process it internally in the code without opening up the code or any sort of window for the user to interact with and potentially mess up your code. And so that's what we'll be covering in a later video. But this video, we discussed the various methods you can use to debug your code, some of the tools that VBA has built into the debug menu, which are very helpful. And we talked a little bit about some of the more common errors that you'll experience in VBA and what to watch out for as you're coding.